The moment my sister slid the box across the table, I knew this wasn't a birthday gift. It was too deliberate, too quiet. The room had been loud, just seconds before silverware, clinking, my mother laughing, a little too brightly, the low hum of conversation bouncing off the walls of the house I grew up in. But when the box stopped in front of me, something shifted. Not dramatically, just enough for people to notice, enough for them to look. "Go on," Lena said, leaning back in her chair like she had all the time in the world. "Open it." Her voice carried. Not loud, not aggressive, just placed carefully, so it reached everyone at the table. I didn't touch it right away. The wrapping paper was smooth, metallic silver, the kind you'd pick if you wanted something to stand out without trying too hard. It caught the light from the chandelier above us, reflecting small flashes across the table like a signal. I glanced at my mother. Evelyn Whitman sat 2 seats down, her wine glass hovering just above the table, her fingers wrapped too tightly around the stem. She didn't meet my eyes, just stared at the box like she already knew what was inside. That was the first moment something felt wrong. Not uncomfortable, not awkward. "Wrong," Clairlina said again, this time with a hint of impatience. "It's your birthday." I reached forward. The paper came off easily, like it had been wrapped quickly, without care. Inside was a white box, clean, clinical. I didn't need to read the label to know what it was, but I did anyway. DNA test kit. The words sat there simple and final. For a second, no one spoke. Then Lena laughed. "Maybe this will explain why you've always felt so out of place," she said, tilting her head slightly, studying my face, like she was waiting for something specific. "You know, like you don't quite belong to the rest of us." A few people shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. No one told her to stop. I felt the heat rise in my chest, sharp and immediate, but I didn't let it reach my face. I'd learned that early, how to keep things contained, how to make discomfort look like nothing. Still, I looked at my mother again. She flinched. Just a small movement, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. But I was, and she still didn't say anything. That silence landed harder than Lena's words. Because Lena had always been like this, sharp, controlled, always just close enough to the line that no one would call her out. But my mother, she was supposed to be the one who stepped in. Instead, she picked up her glass and took a sip she didn't seem to taste. "Relax," Lena added lightly, waving a hand as if she'd said something harmless. "It's just a joke, just a joke." I closed the lid of the box, slowly, my fingers steady, even though my thoughts weren't. The room began to move again. Conversations picked back up quieter, this time, like people were pretending nothing had happened. I sat there for a moment, the box resting in front of me, feeling something settle into place that I couldn't quite name yet. Not anger, not even humiliation. Something colder, something clearer. I slipped the box into my bag without another word. Lena watched me do it. She didn't smile this time. If anything, she looked satisfied, like this had gone exactly the way she expected. And that was when it clicked. This wasn't a joke she came up with on the spot. She had planned this, every part of it. I didn't know why yet, but I knew one thing for certain. As I stood up from that table and walked out of the room that had never quite felt like mine, that test wasn't meant to hurt me. It was meant to prove something. And whatever it was, they were all already waiting for it to come out. The box sat on my kitchen counter in Portland, unopened, catching the soft gray light that always seemed to settle over the city in the mornings. I didn't move it. I made coffee, checked my emails, stood by the window longer than usual, watching a neighbor walk his dog past the same row of hedges I'd seen 100 times before. Everything looked exactly as it should. That was the strange part, because nothing felt the same. The house in San Diego had always had a way of doing that, of slipping under your skin quietly, then staying there long after you left. I had built this life carefully, piece by piece, as far from it as I could manage. Different city, different routines, a job that made sense, Numbers, forecasts, balance sheets. Things that followed rules. Unlike people, I picked up my mug and leaned against the counter, my eyes drifting back to the box. DNA test kit. It wasn't the first time I had been made to feel like I didn't belong. Just the first time it had been handed to me so plainly. Growing up in that house, there was always a center of gravity, and it was never me. Lena had filled rooms without trying. She spoke, and people listened. She laughed, and others followed. Even when she wasn't there, conversations bent in her direction, like everything in the family had learned to orbit her. I learned early not to compete with that. Not because I couldn't, because it didn't matter. When Lena brought home a decent grade, my mother would call it well-rounded. When I brought home straight A's, there was a pause, just long enough to notice, before she said something polite and moved on. Claire's always been independent, she'd tell people, as if that explained everything. It did in a way. Independence was what you learned when no one was really paying attention. My father had been the exception. Robert Whitman wasn't a loud man. He didn't fill space the way Lena did. But when he spoke, it landed. A quiet kind of certainty that didn't need to be repeated. He noticed things, small ones. The way I double-checked my homework, even when I didn't need to. The way I stayed late after school, for no reason other than not wanting to come home too early. He never made a show of it, never corrected the imbalance directly. But there were moments, brief, steady, when I felt seen. Enough to keep me from questioning everything. Or maybe just enough to delay it. After he passed, the house shifted. Not immediately. There was a period where everything was softer, quieter. Grief has a way of smoothing over edges, even ones that have been there for years. But once that faded, things settled back into place. Lena at the center, my mother reinforcing it, and me, somewhere just outside the frame. I set my mug down and walked over to the counter, my fingers brushing the edge of the box without opening it. It wasn't just what Lena had said. It was how she said it. Like she wasn't guessing. Like she already knew something I didn't. And my mother, her reaction hadn't been surprise. It had been fear. I pulled my hand back. No, I wasn't going to jump to conclusions. That had never been my role in that family. I wasn't the one who made scenes or pushed for answers. I was the one who adjusted, who made things easier, who let tension pass without forcing it into the open. That was how things stayed, manageable. I turned away from the counter and picked up my phone, scrolling through my schedule for the day. Meetings, reports, deadlines. Things I could control. Things that didn't shift under my feet. Behind me, the box remained exactly where it was, unopened, waiting. And for the first time, I had the distinct sense that it wasn't just waiting for me. It was waiting for something else to happen first. I didn't open the box that night. I left it exactly where it was on the counter, as if moving it would turn something uncertain into something real. Instead, I went through my routine. Dinner, dishes, a quick glance at the news, the quiet rhythm of a weekday evening in Portland that had always felt steady, predictable. The kind of routine I had built on purpose, something no one else could disrupt. But the box stayed in my line of sight, even when I wasn't looking at it. I went to bed earlier than usual, though I didn't sleep right away. The ceiling above me looked the same as it always did, plain familiar, but my thoughts kept circling back to that moment at the table. The way Lena had said it, the way my mother hadn't said anything at all. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, the apartment was still dim, the soft gray of early morning, pressing gently against the windows. For a few seconds, everything felt normal again. Then I saw the box, still there, waiting. I sat up slowly, letting my feet rest on the edge of the bed, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the next room. There wasn't a rush, no deadline, no real reason to do anything at all. I could leave it unopened, let it sit there until the moment passed, until whatever Lena had meant by it faded into something small and forgettable. That was what I had always done. Let things pass, let them settle. But this didn't feel like something that would settle on its own. I stood up and walked into the kitchen, The box looked smaller, in the morning light, almost harmless. Almost. I reached for it, then paused, my hand hovering just above the lid. If I opened it, I would be choosing something. Not just curiosity. Not just a reaction to what Lena had done. I would be stepping into whatever she had set in motion. That thought stayed with me for a moment longer than I expected. Then I picked it up. The instructions inside were simple, clinical, measured steps, printed in neutral font, guiding a process that didn't care about context or intention. Collect the sample, seal it, mail it. No explanation required. No interpretation offered. Just data. I followed each step, carefully, more out of habit than urgency. Years of working with numbers had taught me that process mattered, that small mistakes could change outcomes in ways you didn't see until much later. When I finished, I sealed the envelope and held it in my hands for a second. It was lighter than I expected. I set it down by the door next to my keys, where I wouldn't forget it on the way out. That should have been the end of it. A simple action, a quiet decision. But as I reached for my coat, something caught my attention. The return label. It was already filled out, not in my handwriting. I leaned closer, reading it again. My name, my address, everything correct. But I hadn't written it. I hadn't even opened the outer packaging until last night. For a moment, I just stood there, the envelope in my hand, trying to place it, trying to remember if I had overlooked something. Maybe it came pre-filled. Maybe I just hadn't noticed. That was the logical explanation, the kind that fit neatly into place and didn't ask for anything more. Still, I turned the envelope over, checking the edges, the seal, the label again. Everything looked normal, carefully prepared. Ready. I exhaled slowly and shook my head. I was overthinking it. That was all. I grabbed my keys, slipped on my shoes, and headed out into the cool Portland morning. The mailbox was at the end of the block. I dropped the envelope in without hesitating this time. It disappeared with a soft, final sound. And just like that, it was done. As I turned back toward my apartment, I told myself it didn't mean anything yet. It was just a test, just information, something small, something contained. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just sent off a sample. I had confirmed something Lena had already been waiting for. I just didn't know what it was. By the third day, the silence started to feel louder than anything Lena had said at the table. It wasn't just that no one mentioned the test. It was that everyone seemed to know not to. My phone sat on my desk in my Portland office screen, lighting up every so often, with routine notifications, calendar reminders, emails, a weather alert, but nothing from my family. Not at first. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt managed. I tried to focus on work. Quarterly reports, client projections, the steady logic of numbers that didn't shift, depending on who was looking at them. It was the kind of work that usually settled me, gave me something solid to hold on to. But I kept checking my phone, not consciously, just enough to notice when it lit up. The first message came late that afternoon. Lena, just one line. Did you send it? No greeting, no context. I stared at it longer than I needed to. Then I set the phone face down and went back to my screen. I didn't answer. Not right away. It wasn't defiance. Not exactly. It was something closer to hesitation, like if I responded, I would be stepping into a conversation I didn't fully understand yet. 10 minutes later, another message. Because timing matters. That one sat differently. I had turned the phone over again, reading it twice. Timing. For what? I didn't reply. Instead, I pushed my chair back and walked to the break room, pouring myself another cup of coffee I didn't really want. The office was quiet, the low murmur of coworkers blending into the background. Normal, predictable, safe. But the word stayed with me. Timing matters. When I got back to my desk, there was a missed call. My mother. That more than anything made me pause. Evelyn didn't call during the day. Not unless something had already gone wrong. I waited a moment before listening to the voicemail. Claire, she said, her voice tight, carefully, controlled. I just wanted to check in. Make sure you're doing okay. Call me when you can. No mention of the test. No reference to the dinner. Just a layer of concern that felt placed not spontaneous. I didn't call her back. Not yet. Instead, I sat there, the phone still in my hand, and tried to map it out in a way that made sense. Lena asking about timing. My mother checking in without saying anything. Both of them reaching out at the same moment, but not to each other, not in front of me, around me. That was the pattern. It had always been the pattern. I was never included in the conversation, just positioned inside of it. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. I finished what I needed to pack up my bag and drove home through the steady Portland drizzle, the windshield wipers moving in a rhythm that almost drowned out the noise in my head. Almost. That night, I placed my phone on the kitchen counter and tried not to look at it. I made dinner, cleaned up, let the quiet settle back into place. For a while, it worked. Then the phone buzzed again. Another message from Lena. You'll want to see this through. I didn't open it right away. I stood there, one hand resting on the counter, looking at the screen as if it might explain itself if I waited long enough. It didn't. When I finally tapped the message, there was nothing else. No attachment, no follow-up. Just that sentence. A statement, not a suggestion. I exhaled slowly and set the phone down again. Whatever Lena had started, it wasn't just about the test. And it wasn't unfolding randomly. There was a sequence to it. A pace, one I hadn't been aware of until now. I moved to turn off the kitchen light, letting the apartment fall into the soft darkness that usually brought a sense of calm. But as I stood there for a moment, longer than I needed to, I realized something I hadn't been willing to name before. I wasn't waiting for the results. Not really. I was waiting for whatever came with them. And judging by the way Lena and my mother were moving, that part had already been set in motion. The email came on a Tuesday at 2:17 p.m. in the middle of a budget review I should have been paying attention to. For a second, I just stared at the subject line. Your results are ready. Everything around me kept moving. Someone at the far end of the conference room was still talking about revised projections for the fourth quarter. A pen tapped lightly against the table. Papers shifted. My coworkers looked exactly the way they had looked 10 seconds earlier. But for me, the room had already changed. I clicked the message open under the table first, then closed my laptop halfway and excused myself before anyone could ask why. The hallway outside was quiet. I walked past the elevators, past the framed landscape prints no one ever really noticed, and kept going until I reached the small sitting area near the back stairwell. It wasn't private exactly, but it was empty. That was enough. I sat down and opened the report. The language was clinical, clear, no drama built into it, no hesitation, just data arranged in polite, careful sentences. No biological relationship detected with submitted family comparison profile. I read it twice, then a third time. My eyes moved lower. Possible lineage match Mitchell. I didn't know the name. It should have felt like the ground giving way, like panic, like the kind of devastation people wrote books about. Instead, what I felt first was stillness. A strange, cold stillness. Not because it didn't hurt, because it explained too much. The distance, the imbalance, the way I had spent most of my life feeling like I had somehow entered the wrong room and then stayed too long. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. That unsettled me more than if they had been shaking. I thought of Lena at the birthday table, the certainty in her voice, the way my mother had gone pale before I even opened the box. They had known. Maybe not every detail, maybe not the wording on the report, but enough. Enough to wait for this. Enough to push me toward it. I could have closed the file right there. I could have gone back into the conference room, nodded at the right moments, driven home, and sat alone with it until I figured out what to do next. That would have been the old version of me, the one who absorbed things quietly, the one who protected everyone else from discomfort, even when the discomfort belonged to me. Instead, I took a screenshot. My thumb hovered over the family group chat for a moment longer than I expected. There were only 3 names in it now, besides mine. My mother, Lena, my Aunt Carol, who mostly sent holiday photos and recipes, and had no idea She was still included in the thread. I typed one sentence. Does anyone want to explain this? Then I attached the screenshot and hit send before I could reconsider it. The message appeared on the screen, neat and final. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the typing bubble flickered once and disappeared. A second later, my phone rang. Mom. Not a text, not a pause, a call. I let it ring twice before answering. Her breathing was the first thing I heard. Claire, she said, and my name came out thin and rushed. Please don't send things like that. Not like this. Not, I'm sorry. Not, are you okay? Not even, what did it say? Just don't send things like that. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the blank wall across from me. Like what I asked quietly, she made a sound that might have been a sigh or a swallow. You don't understand the whole situation. That landed exactly where I knew it would. Because it was the same phrase people used when they wanted you to accept confusion instead of truth. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just listened long enough to hear what wasn't there. No denial, no shock, no surprise. When the call ended, I looked down at my phone again. Still nothing from Lena. No explanation, no defense, just silence. But this time it didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate. And sitting there in that half-forgotten corner of my office, with the report still open on my phone, and my mother's fear still in my ear, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before. If I stayed quiet now, I would be helping them bury it again. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked back toward the conference room, knowing I wouldn't be the same person when I walked out at the end of the day. Something had already broken. Not in me, in the version of the family story I had been expected to protect. Lena didn't call. She didn't text that night, not after my message in the group chat, not after my mother's voice cracked through the phone, telling me to handle this differently. But the next morning, just after 9 a.m., her name appeared on my screen. One message. Now it makes sense. I read it once. Then again. There was no question in it, no curiosity, no surprise, just confirmation. I didn't respond right away. I finished the report I had, sent it off, closed my laptop with more care than necessary. The office around me moved at its usual pace. People walking past, phones, ringing quiet conversations, folding into each other. Everything normal, everything unchanged. Except for that one sentence sitting in my phone. Now it makes sense. I picked up my bag, stepped outside, and called her. She answered on the third ring, what she said not even bothering with my name. Her voice sounded exactly the way it always had. Steady, slightly amused, like she was already ahead of whatever conversation we were about to have. You knew, I said. Not a question. A statement. There was a pause, brief but noticeable. Then a soft exhale. Almost like a laugh, she decided not to finish. I knew enough, she said. Enough. The word landed harder than anything else she could have chosen. How long, I asked. Does it matter, she replied. It did, but the way she said it made it clear she wasn't going to give me a timeline that meant anything. What matters, she continued, her tone shifting slightly, becoming more deliberate, is that now you have the information, and we can stop pretending. We. That word felt misplaced. I wasn't pretending, I said quietly. She let out a short breath. No, Claire. You just didn't ask the right questions. That almost pulled something out of me. Almost. But I held it back. Why now, I asked instead. Why the test? Another pause. This one longer. I could hear something in the background on her end, traffic maybe, or the low hum of a TV. Ordinary sounds, completely out of place with what she was saying. Because timing matters, she said finally. The same phrase. Exactly the same. For what I pressed. This time, she didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was flatter. For things to be corrected. Corrected. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the word settle. That's not your decision, I said. There it was. The first line I had drawn. She noticed. I could hear it in the shift in her breathing. The way the silence stretched just a fraction longer. You really think this is about me making decisions? She said, a trace of something sharper slipping through. Claire, this was always going to come out. I just made sure it happened in in a way that didn't drag on for another 20 years. 20 years. That was the first real number she'd given me. Not proof, but something solid enough to hold on to. You could have told me, I said. I could if she agreed easily. But then you would have done what you always do. And what's that? Nothing. The word was quiet, confident. It didn't feel like an insult. It felt like an assessment. And that was worse. I didn't respond to that, because part of me knew she wasn't entirely wrong. Silence had always been my default, but not anymore. What exactly are you trying to fix? I asked. This time, she didn't soften it. The structure, she said. The way things are set up. What goes where? Who belongs where? My grip tightened around the phone. This wasn't just about identity. It never had been. It was about position, about placement, about what came with it. Lena, I said, keeping my voice even if this is about money. She laughed. Not loudly, just enough to cut through the conversation. It's always about money, Claire, she said. You of all people should understand that. There it was, not a full explanation, but enough to see the outline. You've been planning something, I said. She didn't deny it. She didn't confirm it either. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was measured. You'll understand soon enough, she said. Just don't make things harder than they need to be. The call ended before I could respond. No goodbye. No hesitation. I lowered the phone, slowly staring out at the street in front of me. Cars moved past. People crossed at the light. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Everything still in motion. But something had shifted underneath it. This wasn't about finding out the truth anymore. That part was done. Now it was about what they had been waiting to do with it. And for the first time, I wasn't on the outside of that process anymore. I was in it. By Thursday morning, the story wasn't contained anymore. I realized that when my Aunt Carol called, she never called during the week. Not unless it was a holiday or something minor. She thought I'd appreciate a recipe, a photo, a memory she wanted to share. Her world moved at a slower pace, one that didn't overlap much with mine anymore. But when I answered, her voice was tight. Claire, I saw the message. Not your message. Not what you sent. Just the message. Which meant it had already become something else. I didn't mean to include you in that, I said. I know, she replied quickly. But your mother called me right after. She said there was confusion, that things had been taken out of context. I closed my eyes for a second. Confusion, context, those words again. What did she tell you, I asked. Carol hesitated. That it's complicated, she said finally. That there are legal matters involved. And that it would be better if everyone stopped discussing it. Legal. That word settled differently. Did she mention Lena, I asked. Another pause. She said Lena is just trying to protect the family from unnecessary attention. I almost smiled. Protect. That was a new one. Did she sound worried, I asked. Carol didn't answer right away. Yes, she said quietly, but not in the way I expected. That matched what I had already seen. Not fear of the truth. Fear of what the truth would trigger. After the call ended, I sat there for a moment. The silence in my apartment no longer neutral. It felt occupied, like something had moved into the space without asking. I reached for my laptop and opened the browser, pulling up records I hadn't looked at in years. Property filings, estate summaries, public information that had always felt distant because it never seemed like it applied to me. Now it did, or at least it might. My father's name still appeared on several documents tied to the San Diego property. The house, investment accounts, holdings I had only ever heard about in vague terms, like they belonged to a different version of the family. I clicked through slowly, reading more carefully than I had before. Something shifted, not in the documents themselves, in how they connected. Lena's words came back to me. The structure. What goes where? Who belongs where? This wasn't about a secret. It was about placement. And placement had consequences. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Lena. It was a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring once, then answered. Claire Whitman, a man's voice asked, professional measured. Yes, this is Mark Halpern, calling from Dalton and Reeves. I believe your family has worked with our firm for several years. I sat up straighter. Yes, I said slowly. I'm reaching out because we've been notified of some recent communications involving estate-related information. At this time, we would strongly advise against distributing or discussing any further documentation without proper legal review. The words were careful, controlled, but the message underneath them wasn't. Stop! I felt something tighten in my chest. Who asked you to call me? I said. A brief pause. I'm not at liberty to discuss that, he replied. But I can assure you, this is in everyone's best interest. Everyone. Not you. Not Claire. Everyone. I looked at the open documents on my screen. My father's name still sitting there, steady and unchanged. Is there a problem with the information I shared? I asked. No, he said. But there may be consequences if this situation escalates unnecessarily. There it was. Not a threat, not directly, but close enough. When the call ended, I didn't move right away. I just sat there, the quiet of the room pressing in around me. Lena hadn't just been waiting for the results. She had been preparing for what happened after. And now that it had started, the response was already in motion. Containment, redirection, control. I glanced back at the screen, at the names, the filings, the pieces that didn't fully connect yet. Whatever I had thought this was, it was bigger, and for the first time since I opened that email, I felt the edge of something else beneath the clarity. Risk. Not just emotional, real, structured. The kind that didn't go away if you ignored it. I closed the laptop slowly, then reached for my phone. If they're tiny. They were already moving to control the narrative. Then I couldn't afford to stay where I had been, because staying quiet wasn't neutral anymore. It was a decision, and this time it wasn't one I was willing to make. I didn't respond to the lawyer. Not that day. Not the next. Silence had been their strategy first. Now it was mine, but not the same kind. Theirs was meant to contain. Mine was meant to observe. By Friday afternoon, I was back at my desk, the same documents open, but this time I wasn't just reading them. I was mapping them, accounts connected to properties, dates aligned with Lena's timeline, transfers that looked ordinary until you placed them next to the months my father had been sick. It wasn't chaos. It was patterned. That was the first shift. Whatever Lena had been doing, it hadn't been impulsive. It had been structured, layered, planned over time in a way that only worked if no one else was paying attention. And no one had been, until now. I pulled up another set of filings, cross-referencing names that hadn't stood out before. Trustees, secondary signatories, people who had been in the background of my family's financial structure without ever being introduced as part of it. One name repeated, Dalton and Reeves, not just as legal advisors, as executors. That changed things. I leaned back slightly, letting that settle. Lena hadn't been trying to rewrite something that was undefined. She had been trying to move within a system that had already been locked into place. And she had miscalculated one critical detail. It wasn't hers to control. My phone buzzed again. A message from my mother this time. Can we talk? No urgency in the words, but the timing mattered. Everything did now. I stared at it for a moment, then typed back. Tomorrow. Not avoidance. Not hesitation. Deliberate. I needed one more piece. That evening, I went back through the will summary that had been filed publicly years ago. Not the full version, just the structural outline. Enough to understand how things were arranged without revealing specifics. It confirmed what I had started to see. The estate wasn't just divided. It was protected. Layers of instruction, conditions, oversight mechanisms designed to activate if something disrupted the original intent. My father hadn't just written a will. He had anticipated interference and built around it. I sat there for a long moment, my fingers resting on the keyboard. The quiet of the apartment, no longer heavy but focused. Lena thought the DNA test was leverage, a way to shift perception, to justify a change. But the system she was trying to move didn't rely on perception. It relied on documentation, on intent, on proof. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting to what she had done. I was seeing what she had overlooked. The next morning, I drove downtown to a smaller office listed under Dalton and Reeves, not the main one we had always used, but a secondary location tied to estate administration. The receptionist looked up as I walked in. "Can I help you?" "My name is Claire Whitman," I said. "I believe your firm already knows who I am." There was a brief pause, then a nod. "Yes, of course." I didn't sit right away. "I'm not here to discuss anything informally," I continued. "I want to understand the structure my father put in place. What activates, when, and under what conditions." The phrasing mattered. Not emotional, not reactive, structural. The receptionist disappeared into the back for a moment, then returned. "Someone will be with you shortly." I sat, then, hands folded loosely in my lap, the same way I had seen people sit in rooms where outcomes were decided long before anyone spoke. This wasn't about confronting Lena directly. Not yet. This was about positioning. Understanding where I stood inside a system she thought she could bend. And as I waited, I realized something that settled everything into place. I didn't need to prove anything to her. I needed to let the structure do what it was already built to do. The second folder was thinner than the will, but it changed the room more completely. Mr. Dalton laid it on the table with the same careful precision he had used for everything else that morning, then rested his hand over it for half a beat before opening it. Across from me, Lena had already lost the easy confidence she'd walked in with. She wasn't calm anymore. She was alert in the wrong way, like someone who had just realized the floor beneath her wasn't solid. "This," Dalton said, looking first at Lena and then at the attorney beside her, "contains documentation your father instructed us to preserve in the event of any challenge to the estate." Lena straightened in her chair. "Challenge," she repeated too quickly. "I haven't challenged anything." Not yet. No one said that out loud, but the silence around the table did. Dalton removed the first document and slid it forward. Over the last 18 months of Robert Whitman's life, there were multiple attempts to alter the structure of his estate planning, he said. Requests were made. Meetings were sought. Pressure was applied. Lena's jaw tightened. Her attorney, a neat, silver-haired man named Victor Sloan, picked up the page closest to him and scanned it without comment. I watched his expression shift, not dramatically, just enough to tell me he was recalculating. Dalton continued. "Your father anticipated that questions of biological relation might be used to dispute inheritance. He addressed that directly in the will. He also instructed us to preserve records of any effort to use that information to interfere with his stated intentions." He opened the second section. Bank records, transfer requests, notes from meetings, dates, signatures, amounts. Nothing theatrical. Just the kind of paper trail that leaves no room for personality once it's laid flat in front of people who know how to read it. My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, but I kept still. Several personal withdrawals were made from accounts funded by your father during his illness, Dalton said. In addition, there is written correspondence documenting repeated attempts to arrange amendments to the estate based on information your father had already reviewed and rejected. Lena leaned forward. That is completely misleading. It was the first time she had sounded unsteady. Victor placed the page down carefully. Lena, he said, under his breath, not looking at her, stopped talking. She ignored him. That money was given to me, she said louder now. He wanted me to have it. Everyone knows that. No, Dalton said, calm as ever. The records indicate otherwise. He slid another page across the table. A loan agreement. Signed. Not ceremonial. Not symbolic. Real. The air shifted again. I looked at my mother. Evelyn had gone pale in a way I had never seen before. Not the strained fear from the dinner table. Not the tight defensiveness from our calls. This was something emptier. The look of a person watching a private structure collapse in public. Victor turned another page, then another. Finally, he exhaled through his nose and leaned back. There's a no contest clause, he said, almost to himself. Dalton nodded. A strong one. And if she contests, the remainder of her inheritance is forfeited. Outstanding loans become immediately enforceable by the estate. There it was. Not a threat. A mechanism. Clean. Legal. Final. Lena stared at him. You can't be serious. I am entirely serious. Her gaze snapped to me, then sharp and disbelieving, as if I had done something to cause the documents to exist. But I hadn't. That was the point. I hadn't engineered this. I had uncovered it. The consequences had been waiting for her and long before I walked into that room. This is because of her, Lena said, her voice rising now. She sends one screenshot, one ridiculous accusation, and suddenly, everyone acts like, no, Victor cut in this time firmly. This is because the record already existed. That landed harder than anything Dalton had read. For the first time in my life, I watched Lena run out of space to control, not emotionally, structurally. Her options narrowing in real time, not because anyone had shouted louder, but because the facts had closed around her. And sitting there with my father's name still on the pages between us, I understood what Lena had never expected. She hadn't lost because I fought harder. She had lost because she had mistaken silence for absence and control for permanence. I didn't go back to the house right away, not after the meeting, not after watching everything unravel in a room that had been designed to contain it. Instead, I stayed in a hotel downtown that night, the kind of place with neutral decor and quiet hallways where no one asked questions. I needed the distance, not just from Lena or from my mother, but from the version of myself that had walked into that office, still expecting something to be explained. By morning, the legal part had already begun to settle into place. Victor withdrew from representing Lena before noon. The estate formally issued notice on the outstanding loan by the end of the day. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, just documents, timelines, and consequences, moving forward exactly as they had been written to. Clean, final. I stood by the window of my room, looking out over the city, and realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel relief. Not yet, because relief would have meant something had been restored. And what had happened in that room hadn't restored anything. It had clarified it. 2 days later, I went back to the house. San Diego looked the same as it always had, sunlight stretching across familiar streets, the air carrying that same quiet warmth I used to associate with something stable. The house, too, was unchanged from the outside. White stucco, clean lines, carefully maintained landscaping. Still beautiful, still cold. My mother opened the door before I knocked. She looked smaller, not physically, something else. Something in the way she held herself, like she no longer had the same structure to stand inside of. Claire, she said. Just my name. No script behind it this time. I stepped inside. The house felt different without my father in it. Not emptier, just more exposed, like there was nothing left to soften the edges. We sat in the living room, the same room where Lena had once dominated every conversation, where I had learned to disappear into the background without making it obvious. My mother folded her hands in her lap. I should have told you, she said. It came out quietly, without defense. Not an excuse, not an explanation, just a statement. I nodded once. You should have, I said. She looked down. There were agreements, she continued. Things that seemed manageable at the time. Your father knew. He chose to handle it his way. I didn't ask for details. Not because I wasn't curious, because I already understood enough. The rest wouldn't change anything that mattered. I'm not here for the past, I said after a moment. I'm here for what happens next. That made her look up. There was uncertainty in her expression now, not control. What do you want to do? She asked. It was the first time anyone in that house had asked me that, without already having an answer in mind. I let the question sit for a second. Then I answered it honestly. I'm not staying, I said. Her shoulders dropped slightly, like she had expected something else and didn't know how to respond to this instead. I'm going to handle what needs to be handled with the estate, I continued. And then, I'm leaving San Diego. She nodded slowly. I understand. And for the first time, it felt like she actually did. We didn't talk about Lena. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been documented, filed, and set in motion. Consequences didn't need to be repeated. They just needed to be lived with. A week later, I stood in my apartment in Portland, packing the last of my things into boxes I had labeled for Seattle. The decision had come quietly. No announcement, no explanation. Just a shift, a choice that didn't require permission. I paused for a moment, looking around the space that had held the version of me, who waited, who adjusted, who stayed quiet, because it felt easier than asking to be seen. Then I picked up the last box and carried it out. Some endings aren't about winning. They're about stepping out of a structure that no longer defines you and realizing it never should have. And for the first time, that felt like enough. If you've ever had a moment where the truth changed how you see your family, I'd be curious to hear your perspective. Share your thoughts below. And if this story stayed with you, consider following along for the next one. Each story has a way of revealing something we didn't expect.